After my son fixed my coffee that morning, he stood at the kitchen doorway watching me drink it. I noticed but said nothing. 20 minutes later, I couldn't stand up. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I built a plumbing supply business from nothing over 35 years, and until 8 months ago, I believed my son was a decent man who'd made some poor choices. I believed that right up until the moment the emergency room doctor pulled a chair close to my hospital bed, sat down like a man preparing to deliver news that changes everything, and told me someone had put a dangerous combination of medications into something I'd consumed. The morning started ordinary enough. My son and his wife had been living with me for 14 months by then. They'd moved in after his second business venture collapsed. I'd co-signed a lease they couldn't afford, helped them twice before that with cash, and when everything fell apart again, I told them they could stay while they got back on their feet. That was the kind of father I was, the kind who kept believing the next time would be different. The argument happened the evening before. My son came to my office the way he always did when he wanted something significant. After dinner, when he assumed I'd be relaxed, my defenses lower. His wife hung back near the door, arms crossed, eyes moving between us. He'd put together a presentation. Printed pages, highlighted numbers, a pitch about a logistics company that needed investors before a funding round closed. $45,000, guaranteed returns within 6 months. I'd heard variations of this before. I took the papers, looked at them long enough to be respectful, and slid them back across the desk. I told him no. Not this time. Not this amount. Not this amount. Not this opportunity that I'd never heard of before that moment. He didn't leave. He leaned against the bookshelf and told me that he and his wife had contributed to this household, that they kept the place running, that the house would come to them eventually anyway. That last sentence sat in the air between us. I stood up. I told him this house was mine. I designed it and built it 28 years ago with my wife before she got sick, and I would decide what happened to it. His wife stepped fully into the room then. Her voice went sharp. She said I'd always kept score, always held money over people, always made them feel like charity cases. She said I needed them more than I'd admit. She said things I won't repeat here, things she knew would cut deepest because she'd been in this family long enough to know exactly where the soft places were. I told them both to leave my office. They did. The house went quiet in that particular way. It does after something is broken. I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark thinking about my wife Patricia and what she would have made of all this. She died 11 years ago, cancer, and I'd raised our son alone through his 20s. I blamed myself for some of how he turned out. Too much time at work, not enough at home. I kept making up for it, kept extending grace past the point where grace made sense. In the morning, my son knocked on my bedroom door. He came in looking like he hadn't slept either, apologized for his wife's words, said he'd been under pressure I couldn't understand, said he wanted to make things right. I sat up against the headboard and looked at him. He was 41 years old, and he looked younger right then, the way he used to when he was in trouble as a kid and needed me to not give up on him. He offered to make coffee. Said he remembered exactly how I liked it, black with 1 sugar, the way I'd taken it for 40 years. I said fine. He came back with a mug and handed it to me with both hands, the way you hand something to someone you're trying to show care toward. I took it. It was warm. I drank it while he stood there talking about wanting a fresh start. After he left, I went to the living room with the newspaper. The words wouldn't focus. I thought it was the bad night, the residue of the argument. Then the room shifted. Not like dizziness, exactly. More like the floor had tilted 3 degrees in a direction that floors don't go. My hands felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. I tried to set the newspaper down and missed the coffee table entirely. The phone was on the side table. I got to my knees and crawled the last few feet. My fingers weren't working right, but I managed to unlock the screen. I pressed the 3 numbers. The dispatcher asked where I was. I gave my street address before the darkness took me. I woke up to fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic and a nurse who was checking the IV in my arm. She had kind eyes. She called me by name and asked me to squeeze her hand. I squeezed. The ER physician arrived an hour later. Dr. Whitmore, young, careful, the kind of doctor who doesn't rush, because he's understood that what he's about to say will restructure the person's entire reality. He sat down. He turned his tablet so I could see blood work results I had no ability to interpret. He pointed at specific values. He told me someone had put a sedative called zolpidem and a significant dose of diphenhydramine into something I'd consumed. The combination was dangerous for any adult. For a 63-year-old man with my blood pressure and medication history, it was potentially fatal. I was lucky I'd called when I did. He asked if I'd taken any sleep medications voluntarily. I said no. He asked if there was anyone in my life who might have wanted to hurt me. I closed my eyes. The answer arrived fully formed and immediate, the way answers do when you've already known the truth and just needed someone to ask the question out loud. I asked him not to report it yet. I told him I needed 24 hours to think clearly and verify what I believed before accusations were made. He was reluctant. He told me hospital protocol required reporting suspected poisonings. He documented everything, the conversation, the lab results, the timeline. He told me if anything else happened, if I changed my mind, he expected a call. That afternoon, my son and his wife arrived at my room together. My son came through the door first, his face doing the thing. Faces do when they're performing an emotion rather than experiencing it. His wife followed, hands clasped in front of her, eyes already wet. They fussed. They asked questions about what the doctors had said. They told me they'd been so scared. My son held my hand. His wife fixed my blanket. I played confusion. I spoke slowly, repeated myself, looked at the wrong corner of the room when I answered questions. My son asked twice about my diagnosis, both times phrasing it as concern, but angling for information. I told him the doctors weren't sure. Just a reaction, maybe. Could have been anything. When they mentioned the coffee that morning, asking whether it might have interacted with my medication, my son's wife touched her own throat without seeming to know she did it. My son looked at the heart rate monitor when she did. I catalogued these things and said nothing. They left after half an hour. I sat up immediately and picked up my phone. I needed 3 things: an estate attorney, a private investigator, and a very different kind of patience than I'd ever practiced before. I found what I was looking for. Reginald Ward's law office occupied the 5th floor of a building near the county courthouse in Knoxville. He was 60 himself, deliberate. The kind of lawyer who'd seen enough family ugliness to be unsurprised by anything but still precise about every detail. He listened to my account without interruption. He asked whether I'd been to the police. I told him I wanted what they'd tried to steal from me to be completely beyond their reach before I made any criminal moves. I wanted justice that outlasted any attorney they might hire. He said that was a different kind of case. He gave me the name of a private investigator, Boyd Eckhart, former state police detective, now independent. Boyd met me at a coffee shop 2 days after I was discharged. He was 55, quiet, matter-of-fact in the way of people who've stopped being surprised by human nature. I gave him names, dates of birth, the credit card account I'd unwisely co-signed 3 years prior. I asked for everything. He said 2 weeks, maybe less, if the financial situation was as bad as I suspected. It was worse. Boyd called me on a Thursday. He walked me through the numbers without editorializing. My son carried $88,000 in business loans from 2 failed ventures. His wife had run up $41,000 across 4 credit cards. There were $29,000 owed to private lenders at interest rates that meant the debt was growing faster than any payment could address. 3 accounts were already delinquent. Their combined monthly debt obligations exceeded their income by more than $3,000. I asked how they'd been managing. Boyd said they hadn't been. They'd been juggling, paying minimums by taking cash advances elsewhere. It was a spiral, with no exit except an outside infusion of money. Or an inheritance. I sat with that for a long time after the call. The house was valued at $900,000. My retirement accounts, my savings, the business interests I still held. Together it was more than my son and his wife could make in 15 years of careful living. To them, I wasn't a father. I was a solution to a problem that had gotten too big to solve any other way. The coldness I felt wasn't grief. I'd already grieved at some point I couldn't identify. Maybe when I first understood who my son had become, maybe before that. What I felt now was clarity. I called a security company. 2 technicians arrived while my son was at what he called a business meeting and his wife was showing properties. They installed cameras in the kitchen, living room, and front hallway. Common areas, all legal. I tested every angle on my phone before they left. That night I watched my son pace the kitchen at 11 p.m., his fist hitting the counter twice. His wife sat at the table with her head down. I couldn't make out the words through the audio, but I heard the register of their voices. Fear, urgency, calculation. I updated my will the following week. Reginald's conference room had the quiet gravity of rooms where important things happen. A notary named Carol Reyes checked her supplies. 2 professional witnesses hired through the firm's office reviewed their roles and confirmed they had no prior relationship with me. I signed 3 copies of a document that left my entire estate, the house, the savings, the business interests, to a veteran support organization I'd worked with for years. My son and his daughter-in-law received nothing. A 3-page memorandum attached to the will detailed the poisoning, the hospitalization, the toxicology results, and my reasonable belief regarding who was responsible. The notary sealed it. The witnesses signed. The camera in the corner of the room recorded my steady signature, my clear answers, my unimpaired reasoning. I drove home and placed the will folder on the kitchen counter. I positioned it so the law firm letterhead was visible, but not obviously displayed. Then I went to my bedroom and watched the surveillance feed on my phone. My son's wife came home first. She went to the kitchen for water, noticed the folder, stopped. She glanced toward the hallway. Then she picked it up. I watched her read. I watched her face change. She called my son before she'd finished the first page. He arrived 9 minutes later, read it himself, set it down with the kind of deliberate care that meant his hands wanted to do something else. The knock on my bedroom door came shortly after. My son stood in the doorway. He said there must be a mistake. He said the charity didn't even know me. He said family had to count for something. I told him the will was correctly executed and already filed. He tried reasoning for 2 minutes, then shifted. He said I was making decisions based on confusion, hospital anxiety, bad information. He said I wasn't thinking clearly. I told him I was thinking clearly enough to know what benzodiazepines in my coffee tasted like. His face changed. He said I couldn't prove anything. He said I was an old man making accusations out of grief and medication fog. I said, try me. His wife appeared behind him, tears moving down her face. She told me they owed over $150,000. She told me without the inheritance they'd lose everything. She asked me to understand how desperate things had gotten. I told her I understood exactly how desperate things had gotten. I told them they had 10 days to either pay market rate rent or begin making arrangements to leave. The door closed behind them. I listened to the sounds of a marriage fraying under pressure as they made their way downstairs. 3 days later, Boyd called me. My son had been meeting with a psychologist named Dr. Fuller. Boyd had pulled the man's history. He'd lost his hospital privileges 4 years earlier following allegations of providing diagnosis for hire and disability insurance cases. He operated out of a small office in a strip mall. My son was building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent. I called Reginald that afternoon. He referred me to a forensic psychiatrist, a board-certified specialist who did competency evaluations for courts. 3 sessions over the course of a week, cognitive assessments, clinical interview, memory testing, logical reasoning. I answered every question without difficulty because I had nothing to hide. Her written report was 17 pages. It concluded that I demonstrated full cognitive capacity with no signs of impairment, that my concerns about family members appeared reality-based rather than paranoid, and that I was entirely capable of making legal and financial decisions. I filed copies with Reginald with Boyd and in my safe deposit box. Boyd set up surveillance on Dr. Fuller's office using legal methods. On a Wednesday afternoon, he photographed my son sliding an envelope across a coffee shop table to the man. Boyd's recording equipment captured the exchange clearly enough. My son described what he needed: a finding of severe cognitive decline, inability to manage finances, supporting documentation for a guardianship petition. Dr. Fuller quoted his price and said he'd done hundreds of these. I had it all, every word. Reginald sent a certified letter to my son, legal notification that Victor Cook, meaning me, had been evaluated by a board-certified forensic psychiatrist and found fully competent, and that any attempt to file false claims regarding my mental capacity would result in immediate legal action, including defamation suits and potential criminal fraud charges. The letter didn't mention the recording. Through the cameras, I watched my son receive it. He read it in the driveway, called someone immediately, paced for 11 minutes. That night, he and his wife had their worst argument yet. I caught fragments through the audio. If he knows, we're finished. You should have been more careful. I gave Reginald the go-ahead to file the formal rent demand. The eviction hearing took 8 minutes. I owned the property outright. They had no lease, they'd made no rent payments. Judge Holloway signed the order with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who'd seen this situation before. 30 days to pay market rent plus deposit or vacate. My son's jaw tightened at the plaintiff's table. His wife was already crying. Outside the courthouse, my son tried to get in front of me on the steps. He said I was throwing my own family into the street. He said he'd contest the will and prove I was incompetent. I told him he was welcome to try and that I looked forward to presenting my evidence. Then I went home and called Boyd. I told him to send everything, the medical records, the surveillance footage, the recording from the coffee shop, to the district attorney's office. All of it, organized, indexed, complete. It was time. The lead prosecutor was a woman named Helen Ostrander, 48 years old, with a reputation in Knox County for elder abuse cases and a manner in court that was precise without being cold. She reviewed our 3 boxes of evidence over the course of 2 meetings. She asked about every methodology. Boyd answered every question. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. She looked at me after reading the toxicology report a second time. She said this wasn't attempted poisoning. She said given my age and blood pressure and the specific combination and dosage, this was attempted murder. I told her that's what the ER physician had told me in the hospital. The arrest warrants were signed by a judge 12 days later. Boyd had tracked my son and his wife to a motel on the western edge of the city. They were paying weekly in cash by then, living out of suitcases. A detective named Briggs led the team. He called me at 9 in the morning on the day it happened. He said, "Mr. Cook, I wanted you to hear it from me directly. Your son and daughter-in-law have been taken into custody and charged with attempted murder and conspiracy." I thanked him and set the phone down. The house was very quiet. I sat with that quiet for a while before I made coffee. The bail hearing was the next morning. Helen argued flight risk. My son had been researching one-way fares before the arrest. They had no stable employment. They faced potential life sentences. The judge set bail at $500,000 each. Neither of them could manage the 10% for a bondsman. They were returned to separate holding facilities. The local news ran the story that evening. I was listed only as the victim. Their photographs were public record. My neighbor across the street, a retired schoolteacher named Barbara, who'd lived in her house for 30 years, called to ask if there was anything I needed. I told her no. She said she'd been noticing things for months and had wondered whether to say something. I told her I was glad she was there. The trial came 4 months later. I wore a gray suit. I sat in the gallery for opening statements and watched the jury, 9 women, 3 men, absorb what Helen laid out for them. She was methodical and clear. She told them a 63-year-old man had trusted his son, had opened his home and his finances and his life, and had been repaid with poison in his morning coffee. She told them the evidence would show premeditation, planning, internet searches for lethal dosages, purchases of the compounds, surveillance footage, and a recorded confession. My son's attorney tried sympathy, financial pressure, a good man caught in impossible circumstances. My daughter-in-law's attorney, to no one's surprise, argued that her client had been manipulated by my son and bore less culpability. They were already dividing. Dr. Whitmore testified about the toxicology. Boyd testified about the investigation, and the footage was played for the jury. My son in the kitchen saying if he knows, it's already done. We needed this. His wife nodding with her hands pressed together. My daughter-in-law's recorded confession was played twice. The courtroom went completely silent both times. Her own voice in my living room saying she hadn't wanted to do it, but they were too far in. My son's attorney objected to the recording's admissibility. The judge overruled. Tennessee is a one-party consent state. I had been present and authorized the recording. I took the stand in the afternoon. Helen walked me through it in sequence. The argument, the morning, the coffee, the paralysis, the phone call, the darkness. She was careful, and I was careful, and we told the truth in the cleanest way possible. My son's attorney cross-examined gently, looking for grief rather than anger, trying to suggest I'd acted from vindictiveness rather than necessity. I told him I'd changed my will after my blood work showed someone had poisoned me. I told him that wasn't vindictiveness, that was survival. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, I was in a small room down the hall from the courtroom with Reginald. He came to find me when the clerk announced a verdict. We walked back together. The foreman was a retired postal worker, 62 years old. His hands were steady. On the charge of attempted murder, the jury found my son guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, the jury found my son guilty. The same verdicts for his wife on both counts. My son stood completely still when the foreman read his verdict. My daughter-in-law bent forward over the defense table and had to be steadied by her attorney. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the release of a held breath that had lasted 8 months. Outside on the courthouse steps, Reginald asked how I was. I told him I was ready for whatever came next. Sentencing was 3 weeks later. The judge reviewed everything. He noted the premeditation, the exploitation of familial trust, the targeting of a vulnerable older person for financial gain. He noted the lack of genuine remorse in my son, who continued to maintain his innocence even after conviction. My son received 14 years with parole eligibility at the 2/3 mark. My daughter-in-law received 11 years. She'd cooperated, shown remorse, had no prior record. The judge acknowledged those factors. They were led out separately. My daughter-in-law looked back at me once before the door closed. I met her eyes. I didn't look away, and neither did she. I went home and changed the locks. Every exterior door, the garage, the side entrance, new mechanisms, new keys. I did it myself, the way I used to handle things before I let other people occupy too much of my life. Each lock I installed felt like a small act of reclamation. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee I'd made myself. I thought about my son at 7 years old, helping me lay flagstones for the walkway that still ran from the driveway to the front door. He'd been proud of that work. He'd wanted to show his mother. She'd come out in the afternoon and told him it was the finest walkway in Tennessee. I thought about that boy for a while. Then I went inside, turned off the lights, and went to bed. A month after sentencing, an envelope arrived from the correctional facility. My daughter-in-law's handwriting, 4 pages, blue ink, the paper warped where it had gotten wet. She wrote about what the days were like. She wrote about the weight of what she'd done, described in specific terms, not abstractions. She wrote about a morning years ago, when I'd driven 2 hours in a snowstorm to help them move and had refused to let them pay for my gas. She remembered details I'd forgotten. She asked if I would ever be willing to visit. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She said she didn't expect that. She said she just needed me to know that she finally understood, in a way she hadn't been capable of before, what they had tried to take from me. I read it twice at the kitchen table. I didn't feel anger. I felt the particular exhaustion that comes after something very long and very difficult is finally over. I wrote back. 1 page. I told her I'd received her letter. I told her I believed her remorse was real. I told her I wasn't ready to visit and might never be. I told her I hoped she used the years she had to become someone she could respect. I sealed it and drove it to the post office myself. The house sold 6 weeks later. A young couple with twin boys, engineers both, who walk through every room with the careful attention of people who understand what they're taking on. The wife touched the banister in the hallway the same way Patricia used to. I didn't mention that. I moved into a condo on the 9th floor of a building downtown, 1,200 square feet, a view of the river from the living room. No yard, no maintenance, no rooms full of old arguments. The first morning I made coffee in the new kitchen. Standing at the window watching the river go by, I noticed that my hands were steady, that I wasn't listening for footsteps, that the quiet was just quiet. The Veteran Support Foundation created a fund from a portion of the sale proceeds. A program for elder abuse survivors, legal support, emergency housing, counseling access. Helen Ostrander, the prosecutor, said she'd refer cases to it. Boyd Eckhart said he'd consult pro bono for qualifying clients. I went to the foundation's office for the paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon. The director walked me through the details. She had photographs on her wall of people the organization had helped. Ordinary faces that had been through extraordinary things. I don't know exactly what I felt standing there. Something quieter and more durable than happiness. Something closer to the feeling at the end of very long work that has been done as well as you knew how. I drove home the long way along the river. The water was moving the way rivers move, without explanation, without pause, without any regard for what has happened on the banks. That used to feel indifferent to me. That afternoon it felt like the only right answer to everything. I am 63 years old. I survived. I reclaimed what was mine. I did not let what they tried to make me become. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. There's a photograph I kept. My son at 7 years old, kneeling on the front walkway, pressing a flagstone into the ground with both hands, proud of the work. I didn't throw it away. I put it in a drawer with the documents from the trial, not displayed but not discarded either. That boy was real. What he became later was also real. I've had to hold both truths at the same time, and I won't pretend that's a simple thing to do. What I've come to understand is that what happened to me wasn't random. It followed a logic, even if that logic was ugly. I kept extending grace past the point where grace was helping anyone. Every time I covered a debt, co-signed a lease, opened my home without conditions, I was making it easier for my son to avoid the consequences of his own choices. I don't say that to punish myself. I say it because cause and effect doesn't pause for love. The things we do and fail to do accumulate. They become the situation we're eventually standing in. And I stood in a very bad one. What got me out of it wasn't luck. It was making decisions I should have made years earlier, carefully, without panic, with a clear understanding of what was actually happening. When I was lying in that hospital bed and Dr. Whitmore told me what was in my bloodstream, I had two choices. I could react from grief and shock, or I could think. I chose to think. That choice made everything else possible. The attorney, the investigator, the forensic evaluation, the surveillance, the recorded confession. None of that happens if I collapse into emotion in room 4 of the ER. I'm not saying grief is wrong. Grief is honest, but I've learned the difference between feeling something and being controlled by it. My son and his wife were controlled by their fear, their debt, their desperation. Every decision they made was reactive, short-sighted, governed by what they needed right now. That's what led them to where they ended up. I made myself slow down and think beyond the next hour, the next day. That discipline. Choosing clarity over panic when everything in you wants to fall apart. That's what survival actually looks like from the inside. There's also something I had to face honestly about character. Not my son's character. Mine. I had spent years prioritizing keeping the peace over speaking plainly. I let things go that I should have named. I told myself it was patience, that it was love. But some of it was avoidance. Genuine integrity. The kind that serves the people around you, requires saying true things even when they're hard. I wish I'd said more hard things earlier. I wish I'd held clearer lines. It wouldn't have guaranteed a different outcome, but it would have been more honest, and I think I owed him that much. What I know now, standing on the other side of all of it, is that a person's life is built from the choices they make when things get difficult. My son made his, my daughter-in-law made hers. I made mine. The river doesn't ask whether you deserve to keep moving. It just moves. So do I. That's enough.